a $400 million fortune, an heir with no right to his own life, an empire built on dreams, would become the ultimate nightmare for the family that created it. This isn't a Hollywood script. This is the waking nightmare of Walter Disney's own grandson. His story is the key to unlocking the Disney family curse, a real-life saga of betrayal, greed, and broken souls hidden behind the world's most perfect smile. This is the story of how the family that sold the world a happy ending couldn't buy one for themselves. The Disney curse begins not in a haunted castle, but in a cold house with a cruel father. Elias Disney forbade toys and joy, teaching his sons Walt and Roy that life was brutal. But Walt found an escape. In his drawings, he could control the world. He could erase the bleak reality and draw a better one. That need for control became an obsession after the ultimate betrayal. His first star, Oswald the Lucky Rabbit, was stolen from him by his own distributor. On a train ride home, broken and with nothing, Walt made a vow: never again. Never again would someone take what was his. From that moment on, Walter Elias Disney's mission wasn't just to create, it was to own, to control. It was a vow that built the world's greatest entertainment empire, and it was a vow that would, decades later, destroy his own family. But in that moment of despair, a seed of salvation was planted. He sketched a simple round-eared mouse. His wife Lillian suggested a friendlier name, Mickey. Betting the entire company on synchronized sound, the short film Steamboat Willie premiered in 1928 and caused a sensation. Mickey Mouse became a global star, a symbol of optimism in the Great Depression. Merchandising revenue provided a stable financial foundation, allowing Walt to take even bigger gambles. His biggest gamble was Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs. All of Hollywood called it Disney's folly, believing no one would sit through a feature-length cartoon. The project, costing a staggering $1.5 million, pushed the company to the brink of bankruptcy. But Walt pressed on. On premiere night, even the most hardened Hollywood veterans were seen weeping. Disney's Folly became the highest-grossing film of its time, elevating animation to a true art form. A golden age exploded with masterpieces: Pinocchio, Fantasia, Dumbo, Bambi. Disney was an empire. The empire was built on the myth of a happy family. Walt called his animators his boys. But in 1941, the family revolted. His boys went on strike, demanding better pay. For Walt, this was unthinkable. He would personally drive through the picket lines, staring at the faces of the men he had mentored, the artists who had helped him draw Bambi's first steps. Now they held signs calling him a greedy tyrant. The man who created fantasies for the world couldn't face his own reality. The family was a lie, and the bitterness of that betrayal would curdle inside him, reinforcing the one lesson he trusted: control everything, trust no one. After World War II, Walt looked for new worlds to conquer. He envisioned a clean amusement park where parents and children could have fun together. Against the advice of his brother Roy and all of Hollywood, he poured his own money, even borrowing against his life insurance policy, to build Disneyland. Opening day was a disaster, but the public saw the magic. Disneyland was a resounding success, becoming a cultural pilgrimage site for the American family. But Walt wasn't satisfied. He was horrified by the cheap motels and tacky souvenir shops that surrounded his park. He vowed that next time he would control everything. He secretly bought a vast tract of land in Florida, twice the size of Manhattan, to build not just a theme park, but his utopian city of the future, EPCOT. It was his final dream. Lung cancer wouldn't give him the time. On December 15, 1966, Walter Elias Disney died. The king was dead, and in his wake he left not a simple succession plan, but a complex and controlling last will. In his attempt to protect his grandchildren from the perils of wealth, Walt had inadvertently lit the fuse on a time bomb that would blow his family and his fairy tale reputation apart. When Walt Disney died, a creative supernova winked out of existence. The world lost its master showman, but the Disney company lost its heart, its soul, and its singular driving vision. In the immediate aftermath, a profound sense of paralysis gripped the Burbank studio. The man who had made every single major decision for 40 years was gone. His ambitious Florida project, the utopian city of EPCOT, was now just a collection of sketches and a dying man's final feverish dream. The company was a ship without a captain, adrift in a vast, uncertain sea. Into this void stepped the one man who had always stood in his brother's shadow, the quiet, unassuming partner who had made the magic financially possible. Roy Disney. Roy was 73 years old. He had been planning his retirement for years, looking forward to a peaceful life of fishing and spending time with his grandchildren. But the death of his younger brother thrust upon him a final sacred duty. He knew with absolute certainty that the company could not survive without a Disney at the helm to guide it through the transition. He postponed his retirement indefinitely. His first and most symbolic act was to officially rename the Florida property. His brother had called it Disney World. Roy insisted it be christened Walt Disney World. "I want to be sure," he told his executives, his voice thick with emotion, "that when the public comes here, they know that it was Walt's dream." It was an act of profound fraternal love and a brilliant marketing stroke, forever cementing his brother's name to the project. But it was also a quiet admission of defeat. Roy was a banker, a brilliant financial mind, but he was not a visionary. He knew he couldn't build Walt's futuristic city. The EPCOT project, the experimental prototype community of tomorrow, died with its creator. It was deemed too risky, too complex, too Walt. Instead, the company would focus on what it knew it could build: another castle, another theme park. For the next 5 years, Roy Disney marshaled all of his energy and business acumen to bring his brother's last dream to life. He secured the complex financing, navigated the political labyrinth of establishing the Reedy Creek Improvement District, a special self-governing status that gave the Disney company unprecedented control over its Florida land, and oversaw the colossal construction project. In October 1971, he stood at the grand opening of the Magic Kingdom, his face a mixture of pride and sorrow, and read a dedication plaque, his brother Walt's name on his lips. It was his final tribute. Having fulfilled his duty, Roy finally retired. Just 2 months later, he passed away from a cerebral hemorrhage. The last of the founding brothers was gone. For the first time in its nearly 50-year history, the company was without a Disney to guide it. The era that followed the deaths of the founding brothers is known to Disney historians as the Dark Ages, or the Interregnum. The company was now run by a triumvirate of executives who had been trained by Walt and Roy, Don Tatum, Cardwalker, and eventually Walt's own son-in-law, Ron W. Miller. They were capable managers, good company men who revered the past. But their reverence bordered on paralysis. Their guiding principle seemed to be, what would Walt do? And the answer, more often than not, was to do nothing too risky. The company that had been built on audacious gambles now became a bastion of fiscal conservatism and creative timidity. The animation department, once the crown jewel of the studio, suffered the most. Without Walt's relentless pushing and creative genius, the artistry began to wane. The animation in films like The Aristocats, Robin Hood, and The Rescuers was often recycled from older, better films. The storytelling lacked the emotional depth and innovation of the Golden Age. A new generation of talented animators, including future legends like Don Bluth, John Lasseter, and Tim Burton, chafed under a management they saw as clueless and creatively bankrupt. The studio had become, in their eyes, a factory for mediocrity. The live-action films of the era were largely forgettable, low-budget family comedies, like The Apple Dumpling Gang and a series of films starring a young Kurt Russell. They made money, but they were creatively unambitious and did little to enhance the Disney brand. The company was living off its past glories, its theme parks the primary engine of profit. It was a well-managed but stagnant corporation, slowly coasting on the fumes of its founder's genius. And in the cutthroat world of 1980s, corporate America, a stagnant company, rich in assets but low in stock value, was like a wounded buffalo on the Serengeti, circling vultures beginning to gather overhead. As the company drifted, a quiet rebellion was brewing within the family itself. The conscience of this rebellion was Roy Edward Disney. Growing up as the son of the financial wizard and the nephew of the creative genius, Roy E. had a unique perspective on the family business. He was a quiet, introverted man, lacking the showmanship of his uncle, but possessing a deep, almost spiritual reverence for the creative legacy of the company. He had started his career at the studio in the 1950s, working as an assistant film editor on nature documentaries. He had seen the golden age firsthand. He had watched his Uncle Walt conjure magic from thin air, and he had watched his father, Roy O., meticulously assemble the financial machinery that made it all possible. He loved the company, but he was increasingly horrified by what it was becoming. He saw the creative decay in the animation department and the risk-averse mentality of the leadership as a betrayal of everything his father and uncle had stood for. He sat on the company's board of directors, but his concerns were largely ignored. He was seen as a sentimentalist, a relic of a bygone era, out of touch with the financial realities of the modern business world. The final straw for Roy came in the early 1980s, when the leadership was passed to his cousin-in-law, Ron W. Miller. Miller was a former professional football player married to Walt's daughter, Diane. While a decent man, Roy saw him as utterly out of his depth, a caretaker CEO with no vision to lead the company out of its creative and financial malaise. While Roy worried about the company's soul, Wall Street was smelling blood in the water. A new breed of corporate predator had emerged, the Raider. Men like Saul Steinberg, Irwin Jacobs, and Carl Icahn specialized in finding undervalued companies, buying up their stock, and then either taking them over and selling them off for parts, or threatening to do so until the company's management paid them a premium to go away, a practice known as greenmail. The Walt Disney Company was a perfect target. Its stock price was languishing, but its underlying assets were a treasure trove. It owned thousands of acres of priceless real estate in Florida and California. It had a film library of incalculable value. Its brand name was a global icon. A raider could, in theory, buy the company, fire the animators, shut down the studio, and make a fortune simply by licensing out Mickey Mouse and selling off the real estate. To Roy E. Disney, this was not just a corporate takeover. It was sacrilege. It was the prospect of money changers defiling the temple. In 1984, Saul Steinberg of Reliance Group Holdings launched his attack, acquiring a significant percentage of Disney stock and making it clear he was prepared for a hostile takeover. The Disney management, led by Ron Miller, panicked. Instead of fighting, they prepared to surrender. They paid Steinberg over $325 million in greenmail, buying back his shares at a premium and saddling the company with debt. To Roy, this was the ultimate act of cowardice and mismanagement. They had not only failed to defend the kingdom, they had paid the barbarian to leave, and in doing so, had weakened the castle walls for the next attacker. That was the moment the quiet man decided he could no longer stay silent. On March 9th, 1984, Roy E. Disney did the unthinkable. He resigned from the board of directors of the company his father had co-founded. His resignation letter was a bombshell, a declaration of war against the company's leadership. He accused Miller and the board of being fatalistic and desperate, of leading the company down a path of creative self-destruction. He declared that the company's leadership had lost the faith and trust of the creative people in the company, the shareholders, and the public. It was a stunning act of familial rebellion, playing out on the front pages of the financial press. But Roy knew he couldn't win the fight alone. He needed a general for his army. He found one in his personal financial advisor, Stanley Gold, a brilliant, tough-as-nails lawyer and businessman. Together they launched the first Save Disney campaign. It was a proxy fight, an appeal directly to the shareholders to oust the current board and install new leadership. Gold was the strategist, the ferocious tactician who waged the corporate battle. Roy was the heart and soul of the movement, the living embodiment of the Disney legacy, lending it a moral and emotional legitimacy it would have otherwise lacked. The fight was brutal and public. The Disney board portrayed Roy as a disgruntled family member with a personal vendetta. Roy and Gold portrayed the board as incompetent caretakers who were about to let a pack of wolves devour Walt's creation. In the end, the looming threat of another, even more serious takeover attempt from Irwin Jacobs forced the board's hand. They realized Ron Miller did not have the confidence of Wall Street or his own shareholders. He was forced to resign. The rebellion had succeeded. Roy and Gold now had the opportunity to handpick the new leadership. They looked outside the staid world of Disney and even outside the film industry. They chose Michael Eisner, the hard-charging and ambitious president of Paramount Pictures, as the new chairman and CEO. To balance Eisner's abrasive personality, they brought in Frank Wells, the former vice chairman of Warner Brothers, as president. Wells was a respected, level-headed executive, an avid mountain climber who would serve as the calm anchor to Eisner's creative storm. On September 22, 1984, the new era began. Roy E. Disney rejoined the board, his family's honor restored, and his uncle's company seemingly saved. For a time, it seemed the fairy tale had a happy ending. While Roy E. Disney was fighting his very public war for the soul of the corporation, a much quieter, more insidious conflict was beginning to germinate within the private lives of Walt's direct descendants. This was a battle not for creative control, but for personal autonomy and a staggering inheritance. To understand it, we must go back to the source, Walt's last will and testament. Walt Disney loved his two daughters, Diane and Sharon, but he was also a man of his time with a deeply paternalistic and controlling nature. He was terrified that the immense fortune he had amassed would destroy his grandchildren, turning them into lazy, spoiled trust fund babies. His will, therefore, was not a simple document of inheritance. It was a complex and rigid framework of trusts designed to control his family's access to their wealth for decades. His older daughter, Diane, was the quiet, steady one. She married Ron Miller and focused her life on raising her 7 children, largely shying away from the public spotlight. She would later become a fierce protector of her father's personal history, founding the Walt Disney Family Museum in San Francisco to preserve his story. His younger daughter, Sharon, was adopted by Walt and his wife Lillian as an infant. She led a more turbulent life. In 1959, she married Robert Brown, a marriage that ended in divorce. Then, in 1968, She married a real estate developer named Bill Lund. The marriage of Sharon Disney and Bill Lund produced 2 children, twins named Michelle and Victoria, born in 1970. It was a life of incredible privilege, lived in the shadow of the world's most famous grandfather. But the marriage was not a happy one. Bill and Sharon's divorce in 1977 was acrimonious. Court documents from the time paint a picture of a bitter custody battle. Sharon later alleged that Bill had been abusive, a claim he denied. After the divorce, Sharon adopted a 3rd child, a son named Brad, born just a few days after her own twins. She later remarried to a man also named William Lund, though confusingly, he was no relation to her first husband. This complex family dynamic, divorce, adoption, and remarriage, was further complicated by the immense and looming presence of the Disney inheritance. When Sharon was diagnosed with breast cancer in the early 1990s, the terms of her father's will suddenly became a matter of urgent and terrifying importance. The fortune that would pass to her 3 children, Victoria, Michelle, and Brad, was estimated to be worth around $400 million, but it came with very specific and very dangerous strings attached. Walt's will stipulated that his grandchildren would receive their inheritance not in a single lump sum, but in staggered distributions. They would receive a portion on their 35th birthday, another on their 40th, and the final share on their 45th. But even these distributions were not guaranteed. The will contained a fateful clause, a piece of legal language that would become the engine of decades of litigation and heartbreak. It stated that for each distribution, a panel of 3 trustees had to unanimously agree that the grandchild in question had demonstrated the maturity and financial ability to manage and utilize such funds in a prudent and responsible manner. In essence, at 3 separate points in their adult lives, the Disney grandchildren would have to go, hat in hand, to a committee and prove they were mentally competent and financially responsible enough to receive their own money. The trustees were given enormous subjective power. They were the gatekeepers, the judges of character and stability. Walt, in his effort to protect his descendants from the perils of wealth, had created a system that was ripe for abuse. He had inadvertently built a gilded cage and handed the key to a panel of lawyers and fiduciaries. When Sharon Disney Lund passed away in 1993 at the age of 56, this abstract legal clause became a devastating reality. Her 3 children, still in their early 20s, were now immensely wealthy, but their access to that wealth would be entirely at the discretion of 3 trustees. At the time, those trustees were Sharon's second husband, William Lund, a Disney family lawyer, and a corporate fiduciary. For the twins, Victoria and Michelle, the path, while not without its own challenges, would be relatively straightforward. But for their adopted brother Brad, who suffered from a learning disability and other chronic health issues, the competency clause was a ticking time bomb. It would transform his life from one of unimaginable privilege into a Kafkaesque nightmare, pitting him against the trustees, the courts, and even his own sisters in a brutal, public, and seemingly endless battle for his fortune, his freedom, and his very identity. The family that sold the world the dream of happily ever after was about to descend into its own private hell. In the wake of their mother, Sharon's death in 1993, her 3 children found themselves in a bizarre and precarious position. On paper, they were fantastically wealthy, the beneficiaries of a trust fund worth hundreds of millions of dollars. In reality, they were wards of a complex legal structure, their lives and finances now governed by a panel of 3 trustees. This panel, a rotating cast of family members, lawyers, and corporate fiduciaries, was tasked with a dual mandate: to provide for the children's welfare and to guard the vast principle of the trust until they reached the designated ages of distribution. For the first decade, life settled into a strange kind of normality. The Lund children lived in luxury, receiving generous allowances that far exceeded the wildest dreams of ordinary people. They pursued their interests, traveled, and navigated the challenges of early adulthood. But always looming over them was the shadow of the trust and its paternalistic conditions. They were living in a world built for them by their grandfather, a man who loved them but fundamentally did not trust them. Brad Lund, in particular, was in a uniquely vulnerable position. Adopted by Sharon as an infant, he had been diagnosed with several developmental and learning disabilities. Court documents would later mention conditions such as Down syndrome and fetal alcohol syndrome, though the specifics have been a point of contention throughout his legal battles. What is clear is that Brad faced significant cognitive challenges. He struggled academically and required support in managing the complexities of daily life. In a different family, these challenges would have been met with private care and support. In the Disney dynasty, they became the central pillar of a legal argument that would strip him of his autonomy for the rest of his life. His sisters, the twins Victoria and Michelle, faced their own struggles. Victoria especially led a troubled life. She suffered a severe brain aneurysm in her 20s and reportedly battled with substance abuse. Her life was a tragic testament to the fact that immense wealth is no shield against personal demons. Tragically, Victoria passed away in 2002 from health complications, just after her 30th birthday, leaving her own share of the fortune to be managed by the same trust. Her death was a profound loss for the family, and it further complicated the already tangled legal and emotional dynamics. Michelle, in contrast, was viewed as the more stable and responsible of the siblings, a perception that would later place her in a position of power and conflict with her brother. The year 2005 was the first great reckoning for the Lund children. It was the year of their 35th birthday, the first date upon which they could, according to the terms of the trust, receive a major distribution of their inheritance, a sum estimated to be around $200 million each. Michelle, having been deemed competent by the trustees, received her share. For Brad, however, the gate to the kingdom remained firmly shut. In the years leading up to this fateful deadline, the trustees had grown increasingly concerned about Brad's ability to manage his own affairs. Their official narrative, which would be repeated for years in court filings, was one of protection. They argued that Brad was highly susceptible to manipulation. They claimed that a string of individuals, from girlfriends to opportunistic lawyers, had attempted to take advantage of his cognitive disabilities to gain access to his wealth. They painted a picture of a kind but naive young man who simply lacked the capacity to understand the complexities of his own fortune. To give him direct access to $200 million, they argued, would be like giving a small child a loaded gun. It was their fiduciary duty, they claimed, to protect him from himself and from a world of predators. Brad's supporters and later his own legal team would paint a very different picture. They saw the trustees not as protectors, but as controllers. They argued that the trustees had a vested financial interest in keeping Brad's fortune under their management. The fees for managing a trust of this size were astronomical, running into the millions of dollars per year. By declaring Brad incompetent, they ensured that this lucrative income stream would continue indefinitely. They were accused of infantilizing Brad, of exaggerating his disabilities, and of isolating him from anyone who might encourage him to seek independence. The conflict came to a head in a California probate court. The trustees, which at that point included a corporate bank and 2 individuals, formally refused to make the 35th birthday distribution to Brad. Instead, they petitioned the court to place him under a permanent conservatorship, a legal arrangement that would effectively give a court-appointed guardian complete control over his personal and financial life. The first shots of a decades-long war had been fired. What had been a private family matter was about to explode into a vicious, public, and incredibly costly legal battle. Brad Lund, represented by his own team of lawyers, fought back. His attorneys filed a blistering lawsuit against the trustees, accusing them of a litany of transgressions. The central claim was that the trustees had breached their fiduciary duty. They weren't acting in Brad's best interest. They were acting in their own. The lawsuit alleged that the trustees were engaged in a scorched earth campaign to maintain control of his fortune, systematically isolating him and spending millions of dollars from his own trust to pay the lawyers fighting against him. The legal battle quickly devolved into one of the most toxic and complex family law cases in modern American history. It became a multi-front war waged simultaneously in the courts of California and Arizona, where Brad resided for a time. The case files swelled with thousands of pages of motions, depositions, and psychological evaluations. The allegations grew progressively darker and more personal. Brad's legal team argued that a sinister conspiracy was at play, one that involved not just the corporate trustees, but his own sister, Michelle. At one point, Michelle herself had served as one of her brother's trustees, putting her in the fraught position of having to pass judgment on his competency. Brad's lawyers accused her of siding with the corporate fiduciaries against her own brother, effectively choosing the money over her family. This accusation tore the already fragile sibling relationship to shreds. From that point forward, they would communicate primarily through their attorneys. The trustees, in turn, produced evidence they claimed demonstrated Brad's incapacity. They detailed his spending habits and pointed to his struggles with understanding complex financial documents. They hired teams of psychologists to evaluate him, with those experts testifying that he lacked the mental capacity to resist undue influence. The courtroom became a theater where the most intimate and painful details of Brad's life and disabilities were dissected and debated by highly paid lawyers. The case took an even darker turn when a series of shocking and unproven allegations were introduced into the proceedings by some of Brad's associates and former legal representatives. These included lurid claims of kidnapping and even incest, painting a picture of a family so consumed by greed that it had descended into utter depravity. While these extreme allegations were never proven and were vehemently denied, their mere presence in the court record illustrates the sheer toxicity and desperation that had come to define the battle for Brad Lund's inheritance. It was a legal quagmire, a bottomless pit of accusation and counter-accusation, funded by the very fortune at the center of the dispute. After years of brutal litigation, the courts consistently sided with the trustees. In a series of rulings, judges in both Arizona and California affirmed the trustees' position. They found that Brad Lund did, in fact, lack the capacity to manage his own finances and was vulnerable to undue influence. The court's gavel fell, and Brad Lund, a man in his 30s, legally ceased to be an adult. His life became a parade of absurd cruelties. Imagine wanting to buy a new television. Brad couldn't just go to a store. He had to formally request it from a panel of lawyers. Those lawyers would then hold meetings, write memos, and debate the purchase, all while billing his own trust account hundreds of thousands of dollars for their time. He was paying them millions from his own money for the privilege of controlling him. Walt Disney, in his fear of creating a spoiled heir, had accidentally forged the perfect prison of privilege. His grandson was given all the money in the world, but denied the one thing that truly matters, the freedom to live his own life. The profound irony is that the mechanism Walt Disney created to protect his grandson from the perils of wealth became the very instrument of his suffering. Walt's fear of a spoiled trust fund heir led him to draft a will that, in the hands of determined lawyers and fiduciaries, could be weaponized to create a trust fund prisoner. Brad Lund was given all of the money in the world, but was denied the one thing that truly matters, the freedom to live his own life. His days are spent in a state of perpetual limbo. He has continued to fight, hiring new lawyers and launching fresh appeals, all of which have so far failed to break the legal chains that bind him. His story is a heartbreaking spectacle of wealth and power turned inward, a family consuming itself in a fire fueled by money and distrust. The magical kingdom his grandfather built was founded on the promise of dreams coming true. But for Brad Lund, that promise has been a cruel and bitter joke. His life is a stark reminder that some fairy tales don't have happy endings. In fact, some fairy tales are horror stories. As the tragic saga of Brad Lund ground its way through the labyrinthine court system, a private horror story hidden behind a wall of legal filings, another, very different Disney drama was about to explode into the public consciousness. This new conflict would not be fought over control of an inheritance, but over the moral meaning of that inheritance. It would be waged not by lawyers in hushed probate courts, but by a dissenting heir on the global stage of media and public opinion. The protagonist of this new chapter was Abigail E. Disney, daughter of the corporate crusader Roy E. Disney, and the woman who would become the conscience and the chief accuser of the kingdom her family built. Abigail grew up at the absolute pinnacle of American privilege. She was a Disney princess in the most literal sense. Her childhood summers spent in the family's private castle at Disneyland. But her parents, Roy and Patty Disney, were determined that their children would not be defined or destroyed by their wealth. They instilled in Abigail and her siblings a powerful sense of social justice and a belief that their immense fortune came with an equally immense responsibility. While her peers might have pursued lives of leisure, Abigail was driven by a need for purpose. She earned a PhD from Columbia University, her dissertation focusing on the role of fantasy in war. She became an award-winning documentary filmmaker and a dedicated philanthropist, using her resources to produce and fund films about the very people the Disney brand so often ignores: peace activists, war-torn communities, and champions of social equality. For years, she maintained a careful distance from the family business. She was a shareholder, yes, her personal fortune inextricably linked to the company's success, but she had no operational role. She watched her father's epic corporate battles from the sidelines, supporting his quest to preserve the company's creative soul. But her own concerns were different. They were less about the quality of the animation and more about the quality of life for the people who worked for the company. She was a quiet dissident, privately troubled by the direction of modern capitalism, but she had not yet found her voice as a public crusader. That all changed in 2018 with a single, unsolicited message that would alter the course of her life. The message was from a man named Ralph, a cast member who worked at Disneyland. He had reached out to Abigail on Facebook, not with a request for a handout, but with a cry for help and a plea for understanding. He described a reality that was utterly alien to the happiest place on earth image. He wrote of colleagues who were struggling to afford basic necessities, of the daily humiliation of food insecurity, of workers forced to make impossible choices between paying for rent or for medicine. He told her about the hidden homelessness that haunted the pristine streets of Anaheim, with cast members sleeping in their cars in the employee parking lot because their Disney wages were not enough to live on. Abigail was, in her own words, livid. It was a visceral, gut-level fury. This wasn't an abstract economic problem. This was a profound moral stain on her family's name. The company that had for generations symbolized the very best of the American dream was now, it seemed, a dream-crushing machine for its own people. The name that had given her every advantage in life was now associated with a reality she found repulsive. She felt a surge of personal responsibility, even complicity. This was happening on her watch, funded in part by the dividends that flowed into her own bank account. Her first instinct was disbelief. This couldn't be the full story. So she decided to see for herself. She flew to Anaheim, but she didn't go to the park as a VIP. She arranged a secret meeting. In a crowded Union Hall a few miles from the Magic Kingdom, she sat down with a group of Disneyland cast members. For hours, she just listened, and the stories they told her broke her heart. They spoke of the immense pride they took in their work, in their role as creators of magic for millions of families. And then they spoke of the crushing reality of their lives outside the park gates. One woman described rationing her diabetes medication. Another spoke of the constant gnawing anxiety of not knowing if she could feed her children through the end of the month. They weren't asking for a fortune. They were asking for a living wage, for the dignity of being able to provide for their families. Abigail left that meeting a changed woman. The problem was no longer theoretical. It had a human face. She saw in these struggling workers the same dedication and love for the company that she had seen in her own father, and she felt that the company, under its modern corporate leadership, was betraying them. She had spent her life making films about injustice in faraway places. She now realized the most important story she could ever tell was the one unfolding in her own backyard. The quiet dissident was about to become a very loud warrior. Abigail Disney did not start her campaign through quiet, back-channel conversations with the Disney board. She went straight to the public. In April 2019, she took to Twitter and launched a rhetorical missile that exploded across the internet. Her target was the then CEO of the Walt Disney Company, Bob Iger. News had just broken that Iger's compensation package for the previous year was a staggering $65.7 million. Abigail did the math. It was more than 1,400 times the median salary of a Disney employee. In a now famous tweet storm, she called this pay ratio insane. She wrote, "By any objective measure, a pay ratio over 1,000 is nuts." To put it in context, a single night's stay at the Grand Floridian, the swankiest hotel at Disney World, would cost a full-time ride operator 2 weeks' pay. That's just wrong. The tweets went viral. Suddenly, Abigail Disney was no longer just a filmmaker and philanthropist. She was the Disney heiress who took on her own company, a figure of national fascination and a powerful new voice in the debate over economic inequality. This was just the opening salvo. She followed up with a powerful op-ed in the Washington Post, where she laid out her argument more fully. She argued that the company had become enslaved to the gospel of shareholder primacy, the belief that the sole purpose of a corporation is to enrich its investors. This, she wrote, was a perversion of the capitalism her grandfather and great-uncle had practiced. They would have been horrified, she claimed, by a system that treated its loyal frontline workers as disposable cogs in a machine designed to funnel obscene wealth to a handful of top executives. Her crusade escalated. She appeared on news programs, calmly and articulately dismantling the company's talking points. She testified before the U.S. House Financial Services Committee, using her family's company as the ultimate case study in corporate greed. "The American people are working harder than ever," she told the assembled lawmakers, believing they are doing all the right things, only to be told that their slice of the pie is not a right, but a privilege. To prove that her critique wasn't just about shaming others, she put her own money where her mouth was. She became a prominent member of the Patriotic Millionaires, a group of high net worth Americans who actively lobby for higher taxes on the wealthy, including themselves. She publicly called for a wealth tax, arguing that her own immense fortune was a symptom of a broken economic system. This gave her a unique moral authority. She wasn't an outsider throwing stones. She was an insider, a beneficiary of the very system she was trying to dismantle, now seeking to atone for what she saw as its sins. Abigail knew that to make her argument truly stick, she needed to tell the story in the medium she knew best. She decided to make a documentary. The result was the 2022 film, The American Dream and Other Fairy Tales. It was the culmination of her activism, a feature-length indictment of the modern Walt Disney Company and the economic philosophy that drove it. The film is a deeply personal journey. It skillfully weaves together the story of her own awakening with the heart-wrenching day-to-day realities of 4 Disneyland cast members. The documentary contrasts the company's carefully cultivated public image of wholesome family values with the harsh economic realities faced by its workforce. It argues that over the past several decades, the company has undergone a profound philosophical shift. It moved away from a stakeholder model of capitalism, where the well-being of employees and customers was paramount, to a ruthless shareholder model, where the only thing that matters is the quarterly stock price. The film delves into the company's history, showing how pivotal moments like the 1941 animators' strike and her own father's battles with Michael Eisner were early symptoms of this shift. Economists and cultural historians appear in the film to explain how this Disneyfication of the economy, low wages, precarious jobs, and a massive gap between executive and worker pay has become the norm across corporate America. One of the most powerful arguments in the film came during the COVID-19 pandemic. In 2020, Disney furloughed more than 100,000 of its theme park employees, cutting off their paychecks while the parks were closed. In that same period, the company took on billions in debt, not to support its struggling workforce, but to pay out dividends to its shareholders. To Abigail, this was the ultimate moral failure. The company had chosen to protect its investors over its own people, a decision she found both economically short-sighted and humanly unforgivable. The Walt Disney Company's official response to the film, and to Abigail's broader critique, was largely dismissive. They issued statements highlighting their starting wages, their benefits programs, and their contributions to employee education. They painted her as a well-meaning but naive outsider who didn't understand the complexities of running a massive global corporation, but they could not silence her. The film premiered to critical acclaim at the Sundance Film Festival, solidifying Abigail's status as the Disney family's most powerful and articulate dissident. Unlike the Battle of Brad Lund, which was a tragic internal war over money and control, Abigail's war was ideological. It was a public battle for the very soul of the company. She had inherited her father's fighting spirit, but she was aiming at a different target. Roy E. Disney had fought to save the company's creative magic. Abigail Disney was fighting to restore its moral conscience, as the deeply personal tragedies of the Lund family continued to unfold in the quiet confines of the legal system. And as Abigail Disney waged her public war of conscience, the corporate entity at the heart of it all faced a new and formidable threat. The battle for Disney, once fought by a dissenting family member in the name of creative preservation, was now being fought by a Wall Street titan in the language of shareholder value and corporate governance. The kingdom was once again under siege, not by a dragon, but by a billionaire with a spreadsheet. In late 2023, activist investor Nelson Peltz and his Trian Fund Management launched a major proxy fight to gain 2 seats on the Disney Board of Directors. Peltz, a formidable figure in the world of corporate activism, argued that the modern Disney company was fundamentally broken. He pointed to a sagging stock price, bungled succession planning that had seen CEO Bob Iger awkwardly return from retirement, and a creative engine at the animation and film studios that seemed to be sputtering. His critique was surgical and data-driven. Disney, he claimed, had lost its magic, and the current board was to blame. The campaign that followed was a brutal, multi-billion-dollar corporate war. Peltz and his allies launched websites, published lengthy manifestos, and courted major institutional investors, arguing for a new, more disciplined approach. The Disney company, led by Iger, fought back with equal ferocity, defending its strategy and painting Peltz as a corporate raider who would dismantle the company for a quick profit, a destructive force with no real understanding of the creative business. Into this fray stepped the most unlikely of allies, the fractured, feuding descendants of Walt and Roy Disney. In a rare and stunning display of unity, the family closed ranks. Roy E. Disney's children, including Abigail, released a public statement backing Iger. The descendants of Walt's daughter, Diane Disney Miller, did the same. Even Lorene Powell Jobs, the widow of Pixar founder Steve Jobs and a major Disney shareholder, threw her support behind the current management. Their motivation was a fascinating cocktail of pragmatism and tribalism. For Abigail, it was a choice between 2 evils. As much as she reviled the company's labor practices under Iger, she saw Peltz as an existential threat. His philosophy of ruthless cost-cutting and shareholder-first capitalism represented the very ideology she had been fighting against, but in an even more extreme form. For the other descendants, the motivation was simpler. Nelson Peltz was an outsider. He was a wolf at the door, threatening to tear down the house their grandfathers had built. Whatever their internal squabbles, the instinct to protect the kingdom from an external threat was overwhelming. The family, which could agree on almost nothing else, could agree on this: the barbarians must be kept outside the castle gates. In April 2024, the shareholders delivered their verdict. Disney won a decisive victory, and Peltz's bid was soundly rejected. The family, for a moment, had won, but the unity was fleeting, a temporary truce in a permanent civil war. For Brad Lund, the story remains a tragedy. Now in his 50s, he continues his seemingly endless legal battle for control of his own life. He remains a prisoner in a gilded cage built by his own grandfather, the starkest evidence of the Disney curse, a life of unimaginable wealth that has brought unimaginable suffering. For Abigail Disney, the crusade continues. She has fully embraced her role as the family's public conscience, using her name to fight for a more just world. She is the living embodiment of her father's rebellious spirit, reimagined for a new generation, fighting not just for the company's art, but for its heart. Meanwhile, the quieter descendants, like the children of Walt's daughter Diane, chose to preserve his personal history through the Walt Disney Family Museum. They represent a third way of dealing with the legacy, not to fight it, not to challenge it, but to protect it. Looking at the entire saga, it's impossible not to see it as a classic example of the curse, from shirt sleeves to shirt sleeves in 3 generations. The first generation, Walt and Roy, built an empire from nothing. The second generation were its custodians, and the third, born into wealth, spent the energy their grandfathers used to build an empire, fighting over its spoils and its meaning. And yet, after all the family feuds and personal tragedies, a profound question remains. Why does the magic still work? Why does the name Disney, now linked to so much strife and sorrow, still hold such powerful positive sway over the world? The answer, perhaps, is that the Disney brand has long since transcended the family that created it. For billions of people, Disney isn't a corporation or a feuding family. It is a sacred corner of their own memory. It is the first time you saw a castle you thought only existed in books. It is the song you sang with your siblings on a long car ride. We consume the perfect fantasy and choose to ignore the imperfect, often ugly reality behind it. In the end, the legacy of the Disney family is a story of tragic duality. It is the story of a creative visionary who brought unparalleled joy to the world, and of a fortune that brought so much misery to his own descendants. He built the most wonderful place on earth, but its magic was for everyone but his own. He gave the world a beautiful promise that with a little faith, trust, and pixie dust, anyone can live happily ever after. It is a promise that has captivated us for a century. It is also a promise that his own family has found to be a heartbreaking lie.